Welcome back. We are talking about the respiratory system development. In this section, we'll talk about the clinical correlations that are associated with the faulty development of the respiratory system. We we'll talk about the tracheoesophageal fistula. We'll see how does that develop and what are the various types of it. We'll see respiratory distress syndrome and why it can cause such an effect on the human population, and we'll then see the abnormal ectopic and azygous lobes of the lung and what are their effects on the human body. So first of all, we'll talk about the tracheoesophageal fistula. So what is a fistula? Fistula is an open communication which is open from both sides. Tracheoesophageal fistula. So tracheoesophageal fistula is a open communication between the trachea and the esophagus. We saw the trachea developed from a respiratory bud that extended from the ventral wall of the foregut. Then we saw there was a formation of tracheoesophageal septum by the fusion of tracheoesophageal folds, which completely separated the trachea and the esophagus. If there is some defect in the formation of these folds or the formation of this septum, it results in the formation of tracheoesophageal fistula. So it is an abnormal communication between the trachea and the esophagus. Here you can see this is the trachea on the ventral side, this is the esophagus on the dorsal side, and this is the abnormal communication between the trachea and the esophagus. So it is often associated with esophageal atresia. Here you can see the esophagus is atratic. It is due to defective development of the tracheoesophageal septum. Obviously, it's a communication between the trachea and the esophagus. So something went wrong, and that thing was the tracheoesophageal septum, which was supposed to divide the trachea and the esophagus. So the tracheoesophageal folds, they fail to fuse with each other in a small segment. So in some small region of the trachea and the esophagus, of the respiratory bud, the tracheoesophageal folds, they fail to fuse. So what are the various types of the tracheoesophageal fistula? Let's see. So we have 5 major types. In first type, the tracheoesophageal communication is replaced by a fibrous cord. So there can be a fibrous cord in between, and the lumen may be slightly stenosed. So in the second type, the upper part of the esophagus communicates with the trachea. Here you can see the upper part is communicating with the trachea, and the lower part, it forms a blind tube. It is a completely blind tube, so whatever food one eats, it goes directly to the trachea. So in the third subtype, we have the upper part of the esophagus ending as a blind tube, and the lower part is communicating with the trachea. And this is the most common type. So 85 to 90% of the cases have this type of tracheoesophageal fistula. So in the next type, both the upper parts and the lower parts of the esophagus, they communicate freely with the trachea. Here you can see the upper part of the esophagus and the lower part of the esophagus, they are communicating freely with the trachea. And finally, the H type, in which both the upper and the lower parts of the esophagus communicate with the trachea by common narrow canal, which is known, hence it is called an H-shaped canal. You can see there's a continuation of the esophagus. It is continuous. However, it is also communicating through a narrow canal with the trachea. This is 4% of the cases. Type C is the most abundant, in which the upper part of esophagus ends in a blind tube and the lower part communicates with the trachea. It needs surgical correction because it may cause aspiration, it may cause pneumonia in a child, which is very fatal, in a fetus, which is very fatal. So now the respiratory distress syndrome. We talked about 2 types of cells in the fetus, in the fetal lung or in an adult lung. These were the type 1 pneumocystis and the type 2 pneumocystis. So type 1 pneumocytes are thin walled cells which are actually lining the adult alveolar sacs and help in the gaseous exchange. Type 2 pneumocytes are the cells that are responsible for the production of surfactant, which is a phospholipid rich fluid which helps in lowering the surface tension down when an air fluid interface is formed within the lungs. This lowering of surface tension helps to keep the alveolar sacs open for the exchange of gases to take place. In the respiratory distress syndrome, this surfactant is deficient. Why would the surfactant be deficient? Because the fetus is born prematurely. In a premature fetus who is born before term, we saw there's increased production of surfactant in the last 2 weeks of development, in the last 2 weeks of pregnancy. However, if the fetus is born before that period, there is low level of surfactant within the lung, as a result of which the surface tension between the air and the fluid in the lung is so high that it causes collapse of the alveoli. Here you can see the alveoli have been collapsed because of the high surface tension between the air and the fluid within the lung. If surfactant was present, it could act to lower this surface tension and expansion of the alveoli. So gaseous exchange cannot take place. Individuals who are at increased risk of respiratory distress syndrome are infants of diabetic mothers, C-section delivery because it usually occurs somewhat before term, and birth asphyxia, a child which is asphyxiated during birth. It decreases the risk of what decreases the risk of this respiratory distress syndrome is the prolonged rupture of membranes. That is, the membranes have been ruptured for some time and the delivery took some time to take place, and the prenatally administered steroids. So if you give a steroid injection before delivery, that can help in the production of surfactant. So how would the child present clinically? The child would be tachypnic. Tachypnea means increase in the respiratory rate. There would be nasal flaring. You would be able to visually see the nostrils being flared up due to heavy respiration. There would be expiratory grunting. Grunting is a sound that is produced. Now, expiratory grunting, when the patient would be exhaling air, you would be able to hear it. There would be a visible sound, and there would be retractions that would be visible in the fetus. The management of this condition is through the mechanical ventilation, and exogenous surfactant can also be given. So, infants with the respiratory distress syndrome may require prolonged ventilator support at risk of bronchopulmonary dysplasia because they are premature infants. So, there may be a possibility that bronchopulmonary dysplasia may occur in these fetuses. So this was all about the respiratory distress syndrome. Moving on, we have the abnormal lobes of the lungs. So in the figure, you can see the absence of transverse fissure on the right lung, and this is the transverse fissure on the left lung, which is normal. So they occur due to abnormal division of the principal bronchi into the lobar bronchi. So during the division of principal bronchi to the lobar bronchi, there may be some abnormality. They're associated with anomalies of the lung fissures as well. However, they're not clinically significant because the lungs are performing their function optimally, and abnormal lobes of the lung are not that significant. So what are the ectopic lobes of the lungs? So ectopic lobe of the lungs, ectopic in itself means that it is not in the right place or its original place. So ectopic lung lobe may develop from the trachea or from the esophagus, and they are formed from the additional respiratory buds, and they do not have any effect on the developing respiratory system. Moving on, we have the azygous lobe of the lung. So this is the normal position of the azygous vein, And let's see what happens. What is an azygous lobe? So it is a portion of the upper lobe, this portion of the upper lobe of the right lung that lies medial to the arch of the azygous vein. This is the azygous vein. So azygous lobe of the lung is a portion of the upper lobe of the lung which lies medial to the arch of the azygous vein. Azygous vein lies in the floor of the vertical fissure which is lined by the pulmonary pleura. So I know it's a mouthful and not very interesting, but where does azygous vein lie? Azygous vein lies in the floor of the vertical fissure. Alright. So azygous vein lies in the floor of the vertical fissure. Vertical fissure is lined by the pulmonary pleura. So any part of the upper lobe of the lung that lies medial to this azygous vein is the azygous lobe of the lung. So in this section, we talked about the clinical significance of what happens if the development of lung goes wrong. We talked about tracheoesophageal fistulas and the 5 types of it. We saw the most abundant type being the upper end of the esophagus being the blind-ended pouch, and the lower end communicating with the trachea. Then we talked about the respiratory distress syndrome, how important surfactant was and what was its function. We saw how to deal with the patients of the respiratory distress syndrome, and finally we saw the ectopic lobes of the lung, the abnormal lobes and the abnormal fissures. I hope you liked this lecture and found it interesting. Keep watching sqadia.com.